It was supposed to be just another hearing until Jasmine Crockett walked in like a reckoning. Judge Stones laughed in her face, cut her off, and tried to silence her before 200 stunned witnesses. But in just 47 seconds, she flipped the room, exposed 5 years of buried bias, and made him tremble in his own chair. The woman he mocked became the one rewriting the rules. No shouting, no chaos, just truth delivered like a blade. What truth did Jasmine Crockett unleash in 47 seconds? That shattered Judge Stone's career on the spot. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The federal courtroom in Texas was ice cold and dead silent. No cameras, no press, just lawyers, court clerks, and staff seated stiffly in rows, as if something dangerous was about to begin. Every eye turned as the double doors opened. Jasmine Crockett stepped in. She was 33, calm on the surface, but there was fire behind her silence. Her crimson blazer stood out like a battle flag. Her steps were measured, not hesitant. She wasn't there to be polite. She was there to dismantle. Up on the bench sat Judge Andrew H. Stones, 67 years old. 2 decades of unchecked power etched into his posture. His robe looked more like a throne than a garment. As Jasmine approached the plaintiff's table, he smirked a slow, deliberate stretch of the lips. He leaned forward slightly, eyes cold and amused. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, dragging each syllable. "How refreshing. A politician here to lecture us about the law." His tone dripped with sarcasm. The room tensed. Then came the insult. He looked back down at his notes and said, "Ms. Crochet," mispronouncing her name with deliberate disdain. No correction, no apology, just contempt. Crockett didn't react. Stones continued, cutting her off the moment she tried to speak. "Let's skip the speech," he said. "We're not in Washington anymore." Lawyers in the back exchanged quiet glances. A few raised eyebrows. No one laughed, but the message was clear. He was daring her to lose control, but Jasmine didn't. She stayed completely still, her hands folded neatly on the table, her chin slightly raised, her eyes locked on Stones like a sniper waiting for the exact moment to fire. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch, but her silence was louder than any outburst. And in that silence, one thing became terrifyingly clear: she was calculating. But beneath that terrifying calm, the first shot had already been fired because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to be tolerated. She came armed with proof. She didn't rush. Every motion was deliberate, almost surgical, as she rose to her feet. Her heels echoed once across the marble floor. Eyes followed her instinctively, not just because she was speaking, but because something in her posture said she wasn't asking for space. She was taking it. Her voice rang out clear and sharp, slicing through the courtroom tension like a scalpel. "Your Honor," she began, her gaze fixed on Stones with unwavering precision. "This case concerns over 50,000 voters, disproportionately Black and Latino, who were denied their constitutional right to vote in the state of Texas." The silence didn't break. It shifted. More brittle now. More afraid. She reached for a thick folder, sliding it open with quiet authority. Dozens of signed affidavits, official poll closure notices, and county communications fanned out like blades. No theatrics, just facts. Then she raised a tablet in her hand like a key to the whole case. "We have video documentation from 3 polling locations where eligible voters were turned away at the door." The screen flickered to life but never made it to the jury. "Let's pause right there," Stones cut in. His tone clipped, eyes already rolling. "Is any of this even relevant to federal jurisdiction?" He spoke slowly, condescendingly, as if speaking to a student who had wandered into the wrong class. Crockett didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor. It goes directly to the pattern of suppression under the Voting Rights Act." But Stones leaned back in his chair like he'd heard it all before and didn't plan to hear it again. "Or maybe it goes directly to your next campaign flyer," he muttered under his breath, not even bothering to hide the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Crockett refused to be rattled. She remained standing, the tablet still lit in her hand. "I request permission to display the video to the court." The air waited for his answer. He gave it with the speed and weight of a gavel. "Request denied," he said, without looking up. "This is a courtroom, not a stage for amateur dramatics." His voice cracked like a whip, deliberate and final. The screen went dark. Her hand lowered, but her stance never wavered. From the defense table came a voice, bored and half-hearted. Objection, inflammatory and prejudicial. Stones didn't hesitate. Sustained, he snapped. Then another. Objection, irrelevant. Sustained. Again and again. Crockett couldn't get a full sentence out before the next interruption slammed across her. The courtroom began to feel tighter, like it was shrinking around her. The chandeliers above seemed too bright now, casting harsh white light on a trial that was quickly turning into a farce. The temperature hadn't changed, but it suddenly felt cold enough to hurt. A few jurors shifted in their seats but kept their eyes forward, locked in the performance they'd been forced to witness. Even the defense attorneys, once smug and dismissive, now looked uneasy, like they were standing too close to something radioactive. At the stenographer's desk, fingers hovered midair, unsure if this part even belonged in the transcript. This wasn't procedure, it was suppression. And Jasmine Crockett stood in the center of it, not as a lawyer, not even as a plaintiff, but as a witness to a machine designed to shut her down before she ever got the chance to fight back. But just when it felt like the system had locked every door, Jasmine Crockett did something unexpected. She refused to vanish. And that's when the dam broke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. She simply stood there, rooted in silence for a moment that felt like it held the entire weight of the room. Then came the line measured, razor sharp, and impossible to ignore. Your Honor, this video is not a prop. It's proof of a constitutional violation in real time. It wasn't a plea, it was a warning. And Judge Stones? He didn't flinch. He laughed, loud, deep, contemptuous. It wasn't just inappropriate, it was volcanic. The sound cracked through the courtroom like glass shattering under pressure. It tore through the formality of the setting and left nothing but raw, public ridicule. His laugh lingered, echoed, twisted the silence into something cruel. Even the defense attorneys, who had so far benefited from every inch of his bias, looked caught off guard, unsure whether to grin or cringe. Stones leaned back, his hands folded with smug satisfaction. That might work in Congress, he said, grinning down at her, but not here in a courtroom where the law actually matters. His words weren't just dismissive, they were venom. He had stripped her argument of legitimacy, her presence of authority, and her purpose of value all in one sentence, delivered like a joke told too loud at a funeral. And then nothing. Stillness. Time stopped, suspended by humiliation so thick it clung to every wall in the room. No one moved, not the clerks, not the stenographer, not even the jurors. Every gaze shifted to Jasmine Crockett, waiting, just waiting, to see if that laugh had done what it was meant to do. Crush her, break her composure, push her out of the game. But she didn't move. She didn't look away. She didn't even blink. Her expression stayed unreadable, but her body spoke volumes. There was no retreat in her shoulders, no shake in her hands, only silence. Controlled, unbreakable. And her eyes, those eyes, were locked onto Judge Stones with a focus so fierce it made him stop smiling. She held that gaze for seconds that felt like an hour. Then deliberately, wordlessly, she turned. Not in defeat, not in submission, but with the kind of quiet resolve that precedes a storm. Her heels struck the marble once, then again. Each step toward the evidence table wasn't just movement, it was escalation. She didn't need the court's permission anymore. She didn't need approval. She needed facts. And the way she moved, slow, steady, with absolute control, made one thing painfully clear. The fight had only just begun. And just when it seemed the courtroom had swallowed her whole, when the smirks, the interruptions, and the mockery had done their job, Jasmine Crockett did something no one expected. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She shifted the entire atmosphere of the room with a single deliberate move. Her hand moved slowly to the side of her briefcase, fingers tightening, not with hesitation, but precision. The latch clicked open. Then came the sound thud as a thick folder landed on the table like a warning shot. It wasn't just paper. It was weight, history, strategy. The kind of folder that didn't just contain facts, it carried intent. The courtroom, already tense, fell into a deeper, sharper stillness. No coughs, no scribbles. Even breath seemed like a disruption. She didn't look at Judge Stones. She didn't need to. Her posture alone said everything. I'm not here to plead. I'm here to reveal. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, not soft, but surgical. Before we proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to address a patterned systemic misconduct from the bench. The effect was immediate. Her words didn't echo, they cut. They landed like steel dropped on marble. People didn't react. They froze. Not out of confusion, but calculation. No one moved because everyone knew instinctively this wasn't theater. It was something far more dangerous. She flipped open the folder and began to speak, not in protest, not in outrage, but like someone handing over classified evidence in front of a live wire. Morrison versus Texas, she began, her fingers sliding the top page forward. Her tone was even, but it held an edge so clean it made the room feel smaller. You told the plaintiff's counsel, and I quote, maybe go back and learn constitutional law before bringing nonsense like this into my courtroom. No inflection, no commentary, just the judge's own words, boomeranging back at him with brutal clarity. That case was reversed on appeal, she added. The appellate court called your commentary unprofessional and prejudicial. Her gaze never wavered. Her hand moved to the next page. Henderson v. Spord, she continued. You sanctioned a civil rights team for what you called a media stunt. That sanction was overturned, in full, and the appellate court questioned your motives on record. Her cadence was steady now, like the ticking of a countdown, one line at a time, one verdict after another. The kind of voice that didn't shout because it didn't need to. It trusted the facts to do the demolition. Then came the next strike delivered with the same icy control. Davis versus Attorney General. During testimony, you said, and I quote again, these people need to stop complaining and learn to follow the rules like everyone else. The moment those words left her mouth, the room shifted. It wasn't shock anymore. It was realization. These people, two words that detonated decades of buried bias right in the middle of a federal courtroom. No one dared speak, not even the defense, not even the court staff. It was the kind of silence that doesn't beg for clarity, it demands accountability. The tension in the room snapped taut. Every movement slowed to stillness. Lawyers straightened in their chairs, not out of respect but instinct. Jurors leaned slightly forward, as if gravity had changed direction. The court reporter had stopped typing altogether, her fingers hovering over the keys, frozen between disbelief and obligation. Even the bailiff shifted subtly, his eyes narrowed, his stance just a little tighter than before. The courtroom had been a fortress, but now cracks were showing in the walls. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, unflinching, unapologetic, with nothing in her hands but the truth and a record that no one else had dared bring forward. She wasn't just challenging the judge. She was documenting him, in public, under oath, with a precision that felt less like an argument and more like surgical exposure. Judge Stones didn't speak. His mouth was set in a tight line, but his body betrayed him. His jaw clenched hard, a muscle twitch flickering just beneath the skin. One hand gripped the bench, the fingers flexing and curling against the polished wood. Gone was the relaxed, superior lean. Gone was the smirk. What replaced it was colder, stiffer, tension so visible it had mass. And in that moment, everyone in the room saw it. The silence after Jasmine's final documented quote was no longer just tension, it was collapse. The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. The walls, the lights, the bench, everything was still, as if the building itself was afraid to move. But she moved, slowly, deliberately. The shift in energy was seismic, and the next thing she pulled from her briefcase didn't just carry weight, it carried history. Her fingers gripped the edges of a thick, sealed folder, a different color than the rest, embossed with the official crest of the Judicial Ethics Committee. The moment she lifted it, a new kind of quiet filled the room, not silence, but dread. The kind of silence people associate with verdicts, with last chances. The kind of silence that warns, whatever comes next, it can't be undone. She stepped forward. No rush, no hesitation. Her heels clicked once on the polished floor. Then again, and again. She reached the evidence table, paused, and placed the folder down with a firmness that sent a single, flat thud echoing through the room. She didn't even look at the judge when she spoke. Her eyes stayed on the folder. Her voice, steady and exact, sliced through the air like a razor. This is the official report from the Judicial Ethics Committee. You were investigated in 2021 for bias on the bench. You could almost hear someone swallow in the back row. Then she lifted her eyes calm, unshaking, and locked them onto Stone's. There was no rage in them, no desperation, only cold, clinical truth. You were cleared not because they found you innocent, but because they didn't have enough proof. That was the line, the shift, the subtle breaking of the dam. Her tone never wavered. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't making a speech. She was delivering a post-mortem. Then came the second blow, sharpened with precision. Today I bring 12 new pieces of evidence. She tapped the folder next to it, the folder the one already opened with the 12 cases detailed inside. The soft flutter of her fingers, brushing paper, might as well have been a gunshot. The sound of rustling documents became something else entirely, the sound of a legacy being dismantled, page by page. It didn't take a raised voice. It didn't take anger. It just took her standing there, with everything he'd ever tried to bury now lying face up on the record. No one moved. No one whispered. Not even a cough dared disrupt the moment. For a second, it felt like even the judge himself had disappeared. Not physically, but his authority, his dominance, his towering presence in that courtroom, it evaporated. What was left was a man behind a bench who looked smaller with each breath. Then with complete composure, Jasmine straightened her back, folded her hands in front of her, and said it. Your Honor, I am formally motioning for recusal. The words were crisp, but they didn't ring out. They landed flat and final, like the moment a verdict is read out loud in a murder trial. No inflection, no hesitation, just pure procedural force. She paused just long enough to let the impact sink in, then followed through. I request that this case be reassigned to another judge, one who has not demonstrated a documented pattern of bias in civil rights litigation. It was no longer a suggestion, no longer a professional disagreement. It was a surgical strike executed with legal elegance and undeniable gravity. The kind of moment that doesn't just end a hearing, it rewrites careers. The room didn't erupt. It collapsed inward, emotionally, ethically. The very air felt heavier, like everyone had just witnessed something they'd never forget but weren't sure they were allowed to react to. And then, finally came the final hammer. Her voice lowered slightly, just enough to bring the tension into focus. Her gaze never left him, and what she said next wasn't legal. It wasn't procedural. It was personal, delivered with the grace of a scalpel pressed to the truth. I respectfully suggest you consider whether you are still fit to preside over civil rights cases at all. There was no rebuttal, no outburst, just the kind of silence that feels like it could shatter if anyone dared to speak too soon. Judge Stones didn't respond. He didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't interrupt. He didn't blink. He sat, frozen, hollow. His face had gone pale not from embarrassment, but from the unmistakable realization that he had just been exposed by someone who knew exactly how to do it. His jaw locked, his lips pressed into a tight line. But there was nothing behind it anymore. No fight, no arrogance. Just white knuckles gripping the sides of the bench like he was trying to ground himself in a courtroom that no longer belonged to him. And his hand, that steady hand that had ruled over hundreds of cases without tremble or question, it shook. Not wildly, not dramatically, just enough for everyone to see, just enough to confirm what the room already knew. The man behind the bench wasn't in control anymore. He was watching the walls close in, not from a protest, not from the media, but from one voice, one folder, and 12 cases that he'd hoped no one would ever line up in a row. And now they were lined up, on record, on display. And the judge who thought himself untouchable was silent. The courtroom was no longer a battlefield. The war was over. But the silence left behind wasn't peace. It was reconstruction. After Jasmine Crockett's final words carved through the walls of the courthouse like a slow, deliberate fire, everything froze. No one stood. No one spoke. Even the sound of breathing seemed muted by the gravity of what had just occurred. All eyes cautiously returned to the bench, waiting for something, anything, From the man who used to own that space like a king sitting atop his throne. But now he looked more like a man abandoned by his armor. Judge Andrew H. Stone sat still, his gaze unfocused, his fingers still wrapped around the edge of the bench as though letting go might shatter what was left of him. The robe that once commanded fear now hung limp on his frame. His mouth opened once, then closed. When he finally found the voice he hadn't used in what felt like hours, it was barely there. This court will recess until further notice. The words slipped out so softly they almost dissolved on contact with the air. No gavel slam, no firm inflection. Just a ghost of a voice, a man whispering his own surrender. He didn't look at Crockett. He didn't look at anyone. As if eye contact itself had become unbearable. He didn't stand, didn't blink, didn't breathe like a man who still had power. It was the sound of a door quietly closing on 20 years of dominance. It was the voice of someone who knew, with haunting clarity, he would never command this room the same way again. And on the other side of the room, poised, composed, and untouchable, stood Jasmine Crockett. She didn't gloat. She didn't exhale like someone who had finally survived the impossible. She simply reached down and began to collect her files. Slowly, calmly. Her fingers moved across the papers like someone folding away chapters of a story she'd already memorized. Each document slid back into the folder with surgical control, not rushed, not nervous, just final. There was no trembling in her hands, no victory grin on her face, because this moment wasn't about triumph, it was about truth, and truth didn't need celebration, it just needed to be seen. The courtroom stayed in stasis, as if no one quite knew whether they were allowed to move yet. No bailiff called order, no clerk shifted a page. The air was thick, not with tension now, but with awakening, the kind that comes after something sacred has been broken and rebuilt. Jasmine stood tall, her shoulders squared but relaxed. She gathered the last of her materials, snapped her briefcase shut with a quiet click, and paused not for drama, but for respect. Not to the judge, but to the process, to the law, to the brutal, painful work it takes to hold that law to its own promises. She had said nothing as stones crumbled. She hadn't needed to, because what had just happened in that room was not a performance. It wasn't protest. It was precision warfare, every move calculated, every document authenticated, every word positioned like a pressure point. This wasn't a courtroom speech. It was a legal autopsy, performed with no blood, but leaving the same irreversible impact. And while the judge remained seated mute, pale and unraveling, Jasmine Crockett didn't look back, because she already knew what had happened here. There had been no shouting, no slogans, no crowd-pleasing lines or grandstanding. What had just unfolded was a takedown by truth, quiet, disciplined, and absolutely unrelenting. No one clapped. No one needed to, because everyone in that room understood what they had just witnessed. A new line had been drawn in the sand. For years, Stones had ruled his courtroom with the kind of impunity that wore a robe like a shield. For years, attorneys whispered about the bias, the favoritism, the mockery, but no one had dared say it aloud, let alone in open court. Until today, until her. What had started as a routine civil rights hearing had become something else entirely, a reckoning. And now the reckoning was complete. The courtroom remained still, but something invisible had shifted forever, like tectonic plates moving beneath the floor. A structure had been cracked, a ritual interrupted, an illusion pierced, and the new truth, the one no one dared say aloud but everyone now accepted, was this. The law no longer belonged to the man behind the bench. It belonged to those willing to fight for its meaning, not just recite it. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just walked into that courtroom to argue a case. She had walked in to break a spell. And she had. No shouting, no slogans, just paper, precedent, and pressure. And now, as she closed her folder and turned toward the exit, the silence she left behind didn't feel like absence. It felt like order. Real order. Because for the first time in a long time, the courtroom was no longer a shield for bias. It had become a weapon for justice, and Jasmine Crockett had just reloaded it. The tremor of change that Jasmine Crockett set in motion didn't stop the moment she walked out of the courtroom. It echoed, and what followed was shockingly swift, searingly final. 1 week later, Judge Andrew H. Stones submitted a formal request for an indefinite medical leave, citing health reasons. It wasn't a plea, it was a retreat under pressure. The court clerk announced it quietly. Judge Stones has requested an indefinite leave due to health concerns, effective immediately. No one in the legal community gasped. They already understood what it meant. The man who'd presided with unflinching authority in that very courtroom was stepping down not from weakness of the body, but from exposure of the soul. His voice, once thunderous with command, now existed only in documents. That click of a filing cabinet felt louder than any verdict. 6 months later, he formally retired. Nobody blinked. Legal journals noted it as an inevitability. Bar associations circulated memorandums recalling his once unassailable reputation, now fractured beyond repair. Judge Stones will retire effective today, a statement read. But the fallout had long been clear. A once powerful judicial titan, who seemed invincible just months ago, had dissolved under the weight of his own record. His robe was folded away quietly, not with pomp or ceremony, but with finality. During that transition, Crockett's case did not stall. A new judge, impartial, experienced, and without any stain of bias, was assigned to the bench. At her next hearing, the courtroom looked different. The lighting felt less oppressive, the air less stagnant. For the first time since day one, the video evidence, the recordings of polling places turning away minority voters was allowed. Totally, without caveat. The legal restraint that had blocked every film clip before had evaporated. The screen flickered to life, and the images she described in painstaking detail lines of voters turned back. Poll workers turning away, registered constituents stood unchallenged. There was no inflammatory, no irrelevant, no dismissive glances from the bench. The truth finally had its stage. When closing arguments began, Crockett's voice was firm, but calm, strained with intensity, yet composed. She laid out the constitutional breaches clearly: the denial of voting rights, equal protection violations, discriminatory impact. The defense attorneys tried once or twice to object, but the new judge would not relent today. The courtroom belonged to evidence and fairness, not to interruption and intimidation. Victory came soon after. The judge ruled in Crockett's favor decisively. The judgment wasn't just a narrow win, it was sweeping. The court ordered Texas to reform its election infrastructure, reopen polling centers in historically marginalized districts, retrain poll workers on racial bias and equal protection laws, and implement oversight measures for future elections. The court awarded damages to affected voters and mandated systemic changes, including data transparency on voter turnaway rates by race and precinct. That ruling did more than resolve a case, it was a reformation. This wasn't just the conclusion of a normal lawsuit. It was a structural purge, a cleansing of institutional bias. Courts across the state began auditing past decisions in similar voting suppression suits. What Crockett had done in federal court sparked a ripple effect. Civil rights organizations filed new motions citing her methodology dubbed the Crockett Protocol, calling for transparent documentation of judicial behavior and easier avenues for recusal in cases of suspected bias. Legal clinics at law schools integrated the case into curricula, teaching students not just constitutional law, but also judicial ethics and strategic advocacy. Meanwhile, Crockett herself remained grounded. She didn't use the momentum to launch political theatrics. Instead, she founded a nonprofit legal watchdog dedicated to tracking judicial bias nationwide, compiling statistics, filing complaints, and supporting public defenders and civil rights attorneys fighting similar battles. Her office heard from hundreds of attorneys across the country, reporting cases of stonewalling by biased judges and seeking intervention. She testified before congressional hearings on judicial reform, calling for mandatory bias training, demographic reporting on case outcomes, and lower barriers for misconduct complaints. Through it all, the tone stayed dramatic, but it wasn't circus drama. It was impact drama, the kind that doesn't scream but resonates. The courtroom had changed, the judiciary had been shaken, and a movement was born. What began as one standard case of voter suppression, one folder, one video, one woman standing her ground, became the catalyst for a judicial accountability movement aimed at restoring faith in the promise of blind, impartial justice. Stones's absence became symbolic. Not because he was disgraced, rather, because he represented the kind of unchecked power that had persisted far too long. His resignation left a void, yes, but more importantly, it left space for a system that could no longer hide behind prestige or tradition. The new rule in that courtroom and many others was that bias, once documented, had consequences. For Crockett, the win wasn't about headlines or glory. It was about outcomes millions of Texans were able to register and vote without being turned away. Communities that had been suppressed were counted. The legal precedent she set forced governmental systems to acknowledge and correct inequities. In the public record, the case was no footnote, it was a landmark. From the vantage point of one courtroom, justice had rolled out. From the vantage point of the entire state's legal system, a revolution had quietly begun. Crockett had turned what seemed like a solitary fight into a national reckoning. And while the courtroom remained quiet, the changes it triggered echoed louder than any protest. This wasn't the end of a trial, it was a systemic rebirth. The courtroom had gone quiet, but the outside world had only begun to react. Within days of the ruling, legal organizations across the country released synchronized statements, each one bolder than the last. The American Bar Association, typically restrained in its tone, called the case an inflection point in the conscience of American law. Civil rights groups weren't so cautious. Justice isn't blind if the bench refuses to see, said the National Civil Rights Council. And Jasmine Crockett didn't just make it see, she made it blink. Law journals rushed to update their editorials. Some even retracted past endorsements of Stone's rulings. For the first time in years, federal oversight committees reopened old files that had once been buried under bureaucracy and fear. What Jasmine had done wasn't just litigate, she had detonated a conversation. And across the legal field, no one could ignore the crater she left behind. At top law schools from Harvard to Howard, students arrived at their constitutional law lectures to find something new in the syllabus. Crockett versus silence. It wasn't just a case, it was a methodology, a philosophy, a confrontation with the limits of institutional deference. Professors played the court transcript aloud in class, pausing when Stone's laughed and letting the silence stretch, forcing students to feel what Crockett had faced in real time. They weren't just studying her words, they were studying her restraint, her refusal to match mockery with volume, her ability to turn systemic injustice into procedural exposure. That calm fury became a model. One professor at NYU coined the term Crockett method and outlined its key tenets on a whiteboard: pattern analysis, targeted precedent, and surgical escalation. Not one law student left the room untouched. And in student forums, they didn't ask how she won, they asked how they could do the same. Legal clinics took things further. In San Francisco, a team of civil rights attorneys launched a national training program called the Crockett Protocol. It was simple but revolutionary. Gather evidence of judicial bias, statistically analyze rulings, and create comprehensive case histories to identify repeat offenses from the bench. No more whispered complaints, no more waiting until appeals. Lawyers were now walking into courtrooms with heat maps of discrimination, language frequency reports, and audio logs of verbal bias. Crockett's playbook had shown them that you didn't need to shout to be powerful. You just needed to record, compile, and strike when the system thought you were defenseless. Within 2 months, over 200 legal professionals across the country had adopted the protocol. Judges who once presided with unchecked authority now had to think twice. Every dismissal, every sarcastic remark, every racially coded phrase, they were being documented. And the bench began to feel it. Bar associations started proposing real reforms. In Texas, Florida, and even historically slow-to-change states like Alabama, legal boards began introducing judicial bias reporting systems modeled after Crockett's approach. One reform pushed for all rulings in civil rights cases to be run through independent language audits. Another proposed that judges in counties with high overturn rates be subjected to mandatory review. In one remarkable shift, the Louisiana Bar passed a resolution stating that no judge shall be immune to transparency. The phrase Crockett Clause made its way into internal drafts. Meanwhile, oversight committees that had once lacked teeth were suddenly flooded with new data evidence collected using her model. It wasn't about punishment, it was about patterns. And now they had the tools to track them. News outlets couldn't get enough, but Crockett gave no victory tours, no press conferences, no triumphant speeches. She stayed grounded, returning to her office with the same quiet urgency that had defined her courtroom performance. When asked by a reporter why she hadn't given any interviews, she simply replied, "Because the system's still watching, and I'm not done yet." That single quote was published on the front page of the New York Times, beside a headline that read, "She didn't shout, she documented." Civil rights legends began calling her the Quiet Fire. Columnists wrote essays titled "What We Owe Crockett" and "The Trial That Tried the System." And still, she said nothing more. Because to her, the real verdict wasn't just what happened in the courtroom. It was what came next. Law students began using her case as the foundation for mock trials. Young attorneys cited her filings as a structural example of how to challenge judicial conduct without being thrown out for contempt. Her phrasing, sharp, lawful, and cold, became the subject of rhetorical study. "Your Honor, I'd like to address a pattern systemic misconduct from the bench." That sentence in particular was repeated in moot court competitions across the country, not as imitation, but as tribute. One student at Columbia Law said during a panel, "She didn't attack him, she forced him to recognize himself." And that's more terrifying than any headline. Her impact wasn't about volume, it was about precision, and the legal world was finally catching up to the power of that distinction. Meanwhile, public defenders, long ignored and underfunded, started collaborating across state lines, using Crockett's format to flag judges with consistent bias against poor or minority defendants. In Detroit, a coalition launched BenchTrack, a database that allowed lawyers to anonymously submit rulings, language, and courtroom conduct. Within a week, 5 judges were flagged for repeated patterns. 3 of them changed their courtroom demeanor almost immediately. In Miami, a civil rights firm filed the first formal complaint against a sitting judge using the Crockett Protocol as the evidentiary standard. The bar didn't reject it. They reviewed it. And for the first time in a decade, they moved forward with an inquiry. Crockett wasn't in the room, but her fingerprints were everywhere. And yet, amid the storm she had started, Crockett remained where she'd always been: quiet, focused, watching. Not because she was done, but because she understood something most didn't. Real justice isn't what the system gives you. It's what you drag out of it, case by case, word by word, until even the walls start listening. Her legacy wasn't carved into marble or shouted from podiums. It was being whispered in classrooms, typed into legal briefs, and etched into the new protocols of a profession that had forgotten how to listen to the silenced. She had forced the law to look in the mirror. And the reflection wasn't clean, but now at least it was honest. And just like that, the silence left behind by Stone's collapse wasn't silence at all. It was the birth of a new frequency, one that didn't roar, but vibrated through the columns of the courthouse like a signal that justice, long muffled, had finally found a voice that refused to flinch. That voice had a name, Jasmine Crockett, and within days it no longer belonged to just her. Law schools from Berkeley to Boston began redesigning their constitutional litigation modules, slipping her tactics into casebooks under a new heading: systemic bench accountability. Professors stood before lecture halls with fresh urgency, dissecting her calm under pressure, her unrelenting focus on precision over provocation. Students rewound courtroom footage not to admire flash, but to understand how to build an argument strong enough to bend a federal courtroom without breaking decorum. The lesson wasn't how to win. It was how to confront a failing system, in its own language, and still walk out cleaner than you entered. Crockett became more than a politician or a lawyer. She became a blueprint. Young attorneys who had once swallowed their objections in front of biased judges now stood taller, gripping her precedent like a scalpel instead of a shield. Across law firms and nonprofits, whispered frustration turned into formal motion. The Crockett Protocol became a living method: 3 steps: document, dissect, demand. Legal interns started compiling bench behavior logs. Senior litigators added ethical review briefs to their pretrial routines. In places where silence had been the rule, dissent was now codified and admissible, and it all traced back to one courtroom in Texas, where a woman was told she didn't belong, and proved that belonging isn't granted, It's declared. Crockett's image flashed across news tickers, but not in the way headlines usually treated women of color who spoke with too much clarity. There were no smears, no cheap caricatures, no digs at her tone. Why? Because neither party had a path to discredit her without implicating the truth itself. Liberals couldn't paint her as radical, her methods were too constitutional. Conservatives couldn't brand her reckless, her facts were unshakable. Every line of attack crumbled under the weight of her preparation. She didn't shout. She cited. She didn't accuse. She confirmed. Her voice was so composed that it disarmed bias in real time, leaving only the raw, inconvenient structure of truth for the world to reckon with. And in a nation exhausted by political theater, that truth hit harder than any slogan. Crockett didn't just challenge power, one commentator noted. She redefined how it looks when power is challenged by someone who actually knows the rulebook and isn't afraid to turn every page. That quote alone was printed and taped to office doors from the ACLU to Harvard's Civil Rights Division. On Capitol Hill, staffers on both sides of the aisle scrambled to study her case file, not to poke holes but to insulate themselves from what came next. Because for the first time in years, the judiciary had a reckoning it couldn't outrun. Crockett didn't come to burn the house down. She just found the leak in the foundation and made damn sure no one could seal it with excuses again. And yet Crockett never celebrated. No post-victory press tour, no memoir, no microphone drop. Instead, she went quiet intentionally so the ripple would speak louder than the splash. Her office declined interviews. Her staff sent pre-written responses. Our focus, the memo read, remains on ensuring this ruling translates into systemic, measurable change. And that it did. Within weeks, 2 states reopened dormant ethics investigations. A third added public bench behavior logs to its website. National bar associations amended their judicial review guidelines. What had once been seen as untouchable, the temperament of a judge, was now scrutinized like a statute. But beneath it all, behind the policies and panels, was something even more seismic: belief. For years, reformers had whispered, the system is too big, too slow, too rigged. Crockett didn't disagree. She just didn't stop there. She acted anyway. She didn't wait for a seat at the table. She pulled out a chair, stacked her files, and made the room pay attention. In doing so, she became the face of what many had long feared didn't exist anymore: the possibility that truth, when handled with surgical intent, can still cut through concrete. Crockett became a new model for judicial reform: young, determined, smart, and ready to take on the old power. But it wasn't just what she did, it was how she did it. Without malice, without spectacle, with the sharp edges of logic honed by years of knowing what it felt like to be dismissed before the first word even left her lips. She didn't just stand her ground, she reclaimed it. And in doing so, she showed an entire generation that legal reform doesn't start with a revolution. Sometimes it starts with refusing to lower your eyes in a room designed to make you shrink. Politicians on both sides, both left and conservative, cannot attack her because the evidence is too clear, the argument is too strong. That sentence echoed not just in commentary, but in strategy meetings across party lines. Both sides scrambled to reframe, not to erase her impact, but to pretend they'd always supported it. Because in Crockett's courtroom, the only thing more threatening than her evidence was the fact that she never raised her voice to deliver it. Her tone was her weapon, her logic the ammunition, and the effect was total. From a small trial, Crockett awakened the entire legal profession. That truth rang through every corner of the justice system. What began as one hearing about voter suppression became a masterclass in dismantling judicial bias with elegance and fireproof facts. It wasn't the drama that moved people, it was the precision. It was the look on a judge's face when he realized the rules he once bent now stood up straighter than him. Crockett didn't create fear, she created consequence. And in that shift, the law remembered its purpose not to shield the powerful, but to serve the people who keep fighting to be seen. And long after the courtroom lights dimmed, after the walls stopped echoing the name Jasmine Crockett, the impact of that day refused to fade. What began as one woman confronting a system became something else entirely, an event carved into the architecture of justice. The official transcript, once just a stack of legal exchanges and procedural objections, was sealed, certified, and cataloged by the National Archives. A federal clerk filed it under historic judicial precedent civil rights reform. But those who lived it called it something simpler: the day the bench blinked. The moment when a truth too raw to be ignored exploded inside the clean lines of courtroom decorum. There were no plaques, no headlines, no parades. But everyone who mattered knew something irreversible had happened. You didn't need to print Crockett's name in gold for it to leave a scar across marble columns. The building felt different after that. Lighter. Or maybe just honest. This wasn't about humiliating a judge. It never had been. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom to play hero or martyr. She walked in with receipts. The message, as she would later say in a quiet interview for a legal journal, was never about Judge Stones. It was about the space he occupied, the power he thought no one would question. Because if that kind of power could be cracked in broad daylight, then every courtroom in America suddenly had a mirror to look into. The significance wasn't that Stones trembled. It was that his gavel had finally been weighed against the Constitution and found wanting. That shift, that exposure, became the real verdict of the day. The real judgment wasn't just legal, it was moral, structural, systemic, and it couldn't be appealed. Behind closed doors, senior clerks began whispering phrases like, "the Crockett effect." Law schools clipped segments of her cross-examinations, integrating them into ethics modules and first-year constitutional courses. But none of it was celebrity. Crockett wasn't trending, she was transforming. Her victory didn't shout. It didn't dance on news banners. It moved in silence, like tectonic plates beneath a sleeping nation. And when those plates shifted, the tremor was undeniable. Activists in Georgia cited the hearing. Legal scholars in New York dissected the transcripts. And somewhere in a classroom in Detroit, a law student underlined her name in a footnote and whispered, "Finally." When the footage of that session was played at a symposium on judicial accountability, the room didn't applaud, it stood still. Professors who had practiced for decades said they'd never seen a trial that weaponized silence like that. It wasn't the volume that stunned them, it was the restraint. No raised voice, no dramatics, just the sheer audacity of truth held up like a mirror to a man who'd gone unchecked for too long. And when the video paused on her final line, "I suggest you reconsider whether you're still fit to preside over civil rights cases," the silence that followed wasn't from shock. It was from recognition. Everyone knew that question hadn't just been meant for Stones. It was meant for every judge who ever thought they were untouchable. Years from now, when textbooks mention that trial, they won't frame it as a battle between a rising star and a falling titan. They'll frame it as an inflection point, a shift in how America sees its judiciary not as untouchable, but as accountable. And the legacy won't be the fall of one judge. It'll be the rise of 1,000 who watch that trial and realize something profound. That justice doesn't wear robes, it wears courage. That one sharp mind, when paired with undeniable evidence in unshakable calm, could crack open a courthouse without breaking a single law. And most importantly, that every courtroom has two kinds of silence, one from fear and one from respect. On that day, Jasmine Crockett taught the system the difference. The National Archives didn't decorate her file. They didn't need to, because what mattered wasn't how the story was labeled. It was who would read it. Future attorneys, judges, reformers, students, kids from neighborhoods like hers who had been told that the law wasn't theirs to shape. Now they had proof otherwise, because that transcript, stored in ink and evidence, didn't just say what happened, it testified to what's possible. The Crockett hearing wasn't etched in stone. It was carved into the living fabric of the law. And long after the dust of politics had settled, long after partisanship tried to claim her or discard her, the echo remained. That echo wasn't Jasmine's voice. It was the sound of a system being held up to the light, not to be burned, but to be examined, to be made better. Because, as Crockett had shown the world that day, accountability isn't destruction, it's repair. And light, when used right, doesn't blind. It reveals. But even beyond archives and law schools, beyond headlines and headlines fading, something far deeper had shifted, something you couldn't store on paper or frame in glass. The Crockett hearing had ignited a new internal standard, not for institutions, but for individuals. It was no longer about waiting for the system to correct itself. It was about one voice, one case, one moment ripping the curtain down. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case. She shattered the illusion that justice belongs only to those born into it. She proved that courage, when sharpened by preparation, can become a scalpel capable of dissecting even the most guarded chambers of power. And not with fury, not with noise, but with the kind of composure that makes the room itself lean forward, the kind of quiet that makes truth deafening. Jasmine Crockett proved something most people are too afraid to believe. One person, if ready enough, brave enough, and relentless enough, can bring an entire institution to its knees. She didn't need backup. She didn't beg for coverage. And she didn't bend to decorum that had long been used to disguise discrimination. She understood the game and then rewrote the rules. Because power, when confronted by evidence and moral clarity, has nowhere to hide. That's what made the courtroom fall silent. Not because she shouted, but because she dared to say exactly what no one else would. And say it in the one place no one expected, the lion's den, under oath, with every eye watching. Courage, as she would later tell a group of young law students, is not the absence of fear, it's the refusal to surrender to it. This story, the Crockett moment, will not live on because of how shocking it was, but because of how necessary it became. It's no longer a headline. It's a litmus test, a case study in how truth dismantles protection, how preparation defeats privilege. Generations from now, when students of justice ask what it looks like to challenge the untouchable, they'll be shown that courtroom, that chair, that voice. They won't remember what Stone said. They'll remember how Jasmine made the truth louder than the gavel. This isn't about villain or hero. It's about the cost of silence and the fire it takes to break it. Because systems don't fall from earthquakes. They fall from questions. And she asked the one question that exposed the foundation. Are you still fit to preside over civil rights? There's a myth that justice is slow, detached, and immune to the will of the people. But Crockett broke that myth with surgical strikes of fact, ethics, and strategy. She didn't demand power, she earned it in front of the very machine that tried to deny her place. And she didn't walk away with applause or slogans. She walked away with reform, with respect, with undeniable proof that a courtroom doesn't belong to the judge, it belongs to the law. And if the judge forgets that, someone must remind them. Someone must document the abuse, speak the facts, and be willing to stand when others stay seated. She didn't win because she was loud. She won because she was ready. And when readiness meets righteousness, even the oldest walls tremble. So this story will be told not as folklore, but as framework. Not as inspiration, but as instruction. Because what Jasmine did wasn't magic. It was method. A strategy built from years of watching, listening, and waiting for the exact moment to strike. She didn't walk into that courtroom to be famous. She walked in to be effective. And in doing so, she reminded a nation that injustice doesn't dissolve with time, it calcifies until someone breaks it open. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was aim. Her questions weren't rebellion, they were repair. And her legacy won't be her name. It will be the courage she gave others to stop asking for permission and start demanding accountability. This wasn't about crushing stones. It was about removing shadows. It was about revealing how systems protect themselves by disguising tradition as fairness. Crockett didn't destroy a man, she dismantled the myth of invincibility. She stood where few dared, spoke what few could, and did it with nothing more than truth and nerve. And she proved something lasting, that justice doesn't arrive when you whisper. It arrives when you confront. The message was never vengeance, it was vision. The vision of a system not designed to be comfortable, but to be correct. And when comfort clashes with truth, truth must win no matter how disruptive that feels. So let them study her tactics. Let them print her transcripts. Let them argue over her tone, her tactics, her timing. But let no one forget the outcome. Let no one twist the purpose. Because this story is not about defeating a judge. It's about the mirror she held up and the refusal to look away. Jasmine Crockett didn't just call out injustice, She made it impossible to ignore. She took a courtroom designed to suppress and turned it into a stage of exposure. And in doing so, she wrote a chapter that the law could no longer redact. Justice doesn't need to shout to be heard, but it does need someone willing to stand up and say, this is not how it's supposed to be. Jasmine Crockett did that, not for glory, not for noise, but because she understood the most powerful truth of all. Justice doesn't arrive in silence, it arrives in confrontation. And now, because of her, every courtroom will have to ask itself, is this justice, or is this just tradition dressed up as law? And after all the verdicts, the reforms, the headlines, and the history books being rewritten, what remained wasn't just the sound of a gavel or the echo of a courtroom that had once trembled. What remained was something quieter, but far more enduring. A message. A message that outlived press cycles and political careers. A message that settled not in laws or courtrooms, but in people. Jasmine Crockett's story wasn't about humiliating a man in a robe or bringing down a building of marble. It was about reminding a nation that justice is not a statue, it's a verb, and it only lives if people dare to act. You don't need a title to hold power to account. Sometimes you just need a voice strong enough to shake silence loose from the walls. And that's what she did, one sentence at a time. What made her dangerous wasn't her resume, it was her refusal to be silenced in a room built to keep people like her quiet. She didn't scream, she didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her strength came from precision, surgical, deliberate, and devastating. She showed that bravery isn't always about making noise. Sometimes it's about making truth unavoidable. And when she stood there facing a judge who once believed he was untouchable, she didn't just confront him. She confronted the system that had allowed him to exist unchallenged for decades. If the courtroom is sacred, she once said, then silence is blasphemy. That sentence alone became a rallying cry for a new generation of law students, activists, and ordinary people who had been told their voice didn't matter. But this story was never just about her. It was about everyone who had been dismissed, diminished, or denied. Everyone who sat at the back of the courtroom, wondering if their pain would ever matter. Everyone who looked at a bench and saw not justice, but a locked door. Crockett turned that bench into a mirror. She made the robe transparent. And in doing so, she taught us that institutions don't rot all at once. They erode slowly, silently, unless someone has the courage to pull back the curtain. It takes more than evidence to change a system. It takes conviction and the willingness to lose comfort for the sake of truth. The lesson here isn't that power corrupts. We already knew that. The lesson is that power endures when people refuse to name its abuse. Crockett named it clearly, relentlessly, and with evidence. Not to destroy, but to rebuild. She didn't wage a war of vengeance. She launched a movement of accountability. The fight she picked wasn't popular, and it wasn't easy. But it was necessary. And because she chose to fight it out loud, other people started to believe they could do the same. Because of her, courtrooms stopped feeling so invincible. Judges stopped feeling so invisible. And real people started to matter again in rooms where they had long been statistics. There's something electric about a person who refuses to play by the rules of fear. Crockett didn't just win a case. She rewrote what it means to resist. She reminded us that true justice doesn't ask for applause, it demands risk. And that risk isn't measured in headlines. It's measured in sleepless nights, burned bridges, and the kind of courage that doesn't always feel like strength in the moment. She walked into that courtroom with the weight of a broken system pressing against her chest. And she walked out carrying something heavier, responsibility. Because once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. And once you speak truth in a room trained to ignore it, you become the new standard, whether you like it or not. For every person watching, the real impact didn't come from the ruling, it came from the realization that systems don't collapse from explosions. They collapse from exposure. From someone brave enough to shine light in the places people were told never to look. Crockett didn't just bring a folder of evidence, she brought a flashlight, and she aimed it not just at the judge, but at everyone who sat by silently as years of quiet injustice piled up like dust on marble. Her point wasn't to say, look what he did. Her point was to ask, why did it take so long for anyone to say something? And that's the part that stayed long after the cameras left. In the end, what Jasmine Crockett offered wasn't just a legal strategy or a brilliant performance. She offered a model for courage, for action, for confrontation rooted in care. She proved that you don't have to break the law to break its silence. You just have to speak clearly, stand firmly, and never let fear set the agenda. Her words didn't echo, they carved. Her calm wasn't passivity, it was control. And her legacy isn't about one courtroom or one victory. It's about a blueprint, a way forward, a reminder that justice, when done right, doesn't thunder. It whispers just loud enough that everyone has to stop pretending they didn't hear. And once the lesson's settled, not as a headline, but as a responsibility, the real question began to echo louder than any verdict. What will we do with it? Because Crockett didn't fight so we could applaud. She fought so we could pick up where she left off. This wasn't a story designed to inspire passivity. It was a blueprint begging for action. If you saw yourself in that courtroom as the silenced, the dismissed, the overlooked, then this story wasn't just for you. It was yours to continue. She didn't rewrite the rules of justice to be admired. She rewrote them to be followed. And the first step isn't dramatic, it's simple. Don't look away. Show up in the places that feel too far gone. Speak up in rooms that were never built for your voice. Ask harder questions. Demand paper trails. Make power sweat again. It doesn't matter if you're a lawyer, a student, a cashier, or a teacher, because corruption doesn't care who you are. But neither does courage. And somewhere in your city, your town, your school board, or your courtroom, there is a version of Judge Stones sitting comfortably unwatched, unchallenged, uninterrupted. So the question isn't whether we have another Crockett. The question is whether we have the guts to be one. And if you're wondering what it takes, here's the truth. It takes sacrifice. It takes clarity. It takes knowing that justice isn't given, it's dragged out, inch by people who refuse to settle. So make noise. Take notes. File records. Protect the vulnerable and expose the protected. Because silence is what built the system. But voices, that's what cracks it open. Let this story be your proof. You don't need a title to challenge a throne. All you need is evidence, fire, and a refusal to look the other way when the gavel hits the wrong hands. Crockett didn't ask for permission. She asked for accountability. And now so should you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.